In the summer of 1964, all eyes were focused on the state of Mississippi, deemed the most segregated state in the Union. Less than 7% of African Americans there were registered to vote, and the white establishment intended to keep it that way. But people from the outside saw the injustice and decided to do something about it. About 1,000 students, most of them white and from the North, spent 10 weeks working with grassroots black Mississippians to make a change. It was called Freedom Summer, and we'll talk about it on this Another View history lesson. Up next, after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. My thanks to Lisa Godley for sitting in the chair last week while I spent some time with my granddaughter who had surgery, and thank goodness everything worked out just fine. I appreciate that. A couple of things to talk to you about before we get into our discussion today about Freedom Summer. Portsmouth Naval Hospital remains on lockdown as police search for the man who stabbed a service member outside the Navy Exchange this morning. That service member is currently being treated at the medical center for critical injuries. Police say they know who the suspect is, and they say he is still on the loose. He is described as a white male, 165 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a white T-shirt, tan pants, and blue tennis shoes. The attack happened around 8:30 this morning, and as a result of the lockdown, the facility is closed to inbound and outbound traffic. So if you have appointments or business at the hospital, you're asked to stay away at this time. The latest that we received is that they have now started to let people off the premises of Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, but they are searching every car. So that's going to take quite a while. Traffic is tied up. So if you don't have to go in that area, please stay away so that the police can do their job. And the black press this week lost a champion, and Virginia lost a voice for the black community in the death of founder, publisher, and editor of the Richmond Free Press, Raymond Boone. Boone died of pancreatic cancer. He was 76 years old. Raymond Boone served as a reporter for what is today Norfolk's New Journal and Guide, as well as the Suffolk News Herald. He served as editor and vice president of the Baltimore Afro-American Newspaper Group. He taught journalism at Howard University before starting the Richmond Free Press in 1992. Time magazine credited Boone with bringing, quote, sophistication and verve to the black press. Raymond Boone died this past Tuesday, and we here at Another View send our condolences to the Boone family, and next Tuesday will be his services. And the effort to educate the community about prostate cancer continues with the Prostate Health Educational Symposium on Saturday, June 14th from 10 until noon at Carver Memorial Presbyterian Church on 25th Street in Newport News. It's free and open to everyone and includes lunch. Now, one in 5 black men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer within their lifetime and will die from the disease at a rate 2.5 times greater than men of all other ethnic groups. So it's important to learn as much as you can about this disease. For more information about the symposium, call Charlie Hill with the Hampton Roads Prostate Health Forum at 757-827-0488. So just some information for you this Friday afternoon. So here's a question for you. Would you be willing to die for the right to vote? I imagine that might be a hard concept for many today, considering we all have the right to vote, and sadly, many people don't exercise that right. Back in 1964, only 7% of the black population in Mississippi was registered to vote, compared to between 50 and 70% of blacks in other southern states. The white establishment did all it could to discourage African Americans from voting, but something happened in the summer of 1964 in Mississippi that changed the lives of both blacks and whites in that southern state. It was called Freedom Summer. And here to give us an Another View history lesson is Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, professor of history and the director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the Study of the African Diaspora at Norfolk State University. Hi, Cassandra. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Dr. Eric Claville, assistant dean for the School of Liberal Arts and assistant professor of political science and history, and also the director of the Pre-Law Institute at Hampton University. Hi, Eric. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And Associate Professor Frank Edgcombe, who is interim director of the William R. and Norma B. Harvey Library on the campus of Hampton University. Frank, welcome to Another View.
Thank you.
So glad to have you on. Now, before we get started, I want you to know that PBS on WHRO TV 15 on Tuesday, June 24th, there will be a documentary called Freedom Summer. Let's listen to a clip from the documentary.
I don't want the Negro as I have known him and contacted him during my lifetime to control the making of a law that controls me.
I don't think people understand how violent Mississippi was. If black people try and vote, they can get hurt or killed.
You're not a registered voter, you're not a first-class citizen.
They would say, you're right, boy. We should be registered to vote. But I ain't going down there to mess with them white people.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 students from all around the country who will engage in freedom schools, voter registration activities, and open up Mississippi to the country.
We face absolute extinction of all we hold dear. We must be strong enough to crush the enemy.
The three civil rights workers who disappeared in Mississippi last Sunday night still have not been heard from.
It was always in the back of everybody's minds that bad things were going to happen. But if you cared about this country and you cared about democracy, then you had to go down.
So if you cared about this country and you cared about democracy, you had to go to Mississippi. Cassandra, set the stage for us. What was happening in the South overall, and why was Mississippi such a special case?
Oh, wow. That was a nice, easy question for me. Okay, well, the nation had experienced the March on Washington in '63, and around that same time we saw the continuation of outbreaks of violence as African Americans pushed the envelope. There have been so many court cases challenging segregation for 100+ years. And it wasn't until the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed that it, in one fell swoop, did perhaps more than all of the cases put together, in that the federal government was now saying there needs to be an end to this dual citizenship that is actually contrary to the Constitution. And we're going to put in place certain programs to help facilitate the desegregation of our society. And it's at that point that pretty much all the states, not just the southern states, but you saw the northern states kind of sitting quietly and thinking, okay, how can we avoid this as well? And they did it in very subtle ways. But
can you give us an example of a way?
For example, you have a continuation in some some northern cities of segregation. Boston, of course, blew up in the early 1970s when busing was brought into Boston, and you saw all the violence associated with that. You had ongoing segregation in Pennsylvania. In fact, in recent elections, and in Ohio, you've seen a blow-up of what has been sort of the nation's secret, that there's segregation in the North just as in the South. It's just that the North didn't put big signs saying white only and colored only. They had residential segregation that was strictly enforced. They used municipal laws allowing people to charge different rates for housing, for rental properties. They wouldn't sell to people of color. And so you had, ongoing segregation in so many ways in the North. And, of course, the public facilities, there was a lot of segregation. In the South, it was just more obvious. And in part because you're still seeing a predominant number of blacks in the South versus in the North. That would begin to shift in the 1960s and 70s, which would cause further reason for an explosion in the North versus in the South. There's this myth that somehow
it only was going on in the South.
Not only that, but that somehow there'd already been this urban shift of African Americans right after the First World War, when that was perhaps the second major movement northward. The first major movement northward by African Americans was actually following the Civil War. And a lot of people ignore that time period. And then the second was really what they call the Great Migration following the First World War. And then you saw a third one following the Second World War. Or I shouldn't say following the second, but during the Second World War. And all of it was motivated by jobs, opportunities, better lifestyle, and getting out of this very, very oppressive Southern society in which so many laws following the Civil War were passed that would limit the rights of African Americans. And many of these laws were being used, interestingly, by civil rights workers as well as by Southern opponents of equality and rights. Many of these laws were used in both ways to either try to enlarge the rights of blacks or try to constrict those rights. So these antiquated laws that were sitting on the books, there was one in Savannah, Georgia, that allowed for people to vote, and that was to open the door for ex-Confederates. And so there were some blacks who found that law and used that to help. But then they would take other kinds of laws and use those to restrict black voting. So this was the scenario in the country. Why it was more problematic in Mississippi had to do with really, if you look at the demographics of slavery, then toward the end of the antebellum period, the larger numbers of enslaved people were being brought into Mississippi. This was perhaps the last place in this country up to that point that provided whites the opportunity to become middle class. So Mississippi became this place, this haven for a lot of poorer whites who could get a little bit of money to purchase a slave and become middle class. So unlike other places in the country, this was a magnet for a lot of wannabe white middle class Americans. And Mississippi never changed in the way that it thought about itself. It thought about its opportunities, and more importantly, it thought about how to exploit the labor and the lives of African Americans.
So, Eric, in 64, then, let's talk a little bit about how Freedom Summer actually got started. What was the catalyst to bring all of these students from the North down?
Well, just as Cassandra noted, during that time period, you had public policy and laws that restricted any rights or really disenfranchised African Americans. More specifically, the voting aspect was African Americans were disenfranchised. We know that in our country and democracy, one man, one vote, it really moves not only people, but it moves institutions. It changes things. So by taking away that right and disenfranchising those African Americans, even though they were given the right to vote under what we call the Reconstruction after the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, 15 Amendment, they were still being disenfranchised. So, for example, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and the like. So now you see this movement. Now, there were local movements in Mississippi, all right, where individuals wanted to fight for the right to vote. However, the North decided to come down, and you have this thing called Freedom Summer, also known as the Mississippi Summer Project. And it was a campaign launched here in the United States in June of 1964 to attempt to register as many African American voters as possible in the state of Mississippi, which, of course, historically excluded African Americans from voting. Now, this was primarily pushed by students coming down from the North. 90% white, mostly Jewish. All right, students coming from the North to come to Mississippi, a place that they've only read about, this mythical place. And they came there and they trained, they lived with the local people there, and they really experienced what life was really like.
I wanted to ask also, because I'm trying to find the Western College for Women in Oxford, Ohio, was the place where they did the training. What was and this is up to anyone, but what was the catalyst for that university or that college? Why did they pick that place? Does anyone know? Or if there was any, were they particularly into civil rights and trying to make change? Or
I really don't. I haven't studied all the specifics on the local or the Mississippi civil rights efforts. Mississippi was a place where African Americans were agitating. Some of your most vocal civil rights activists came out of Hattiesville, Mississippi. They were stalwarts, and they knew that by speaking up, they risked death. In fact, during the Freedom Summer, you had a lot of African Americans in Mississippi who hosted these students, who sat on their porch at night with a shotgun to protect the people who were in the house as well as their families. And when those students went back to their safe enclaves in the North, these people in Mississippi still had to live with what they were standing up for. And I think that it is such a sad commentary in our society when we focus on these leaders who swoop in from the outside, and we forget the people who were there, who continue to fight for their rights, who suffered the consequences. It's just like when the three men who, the slain civil rights workers. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because there was a whole big thing around that. But when they were trying to find them, they discovered hundreds of bodies of African American men and women who had been killed, who had been thrown in rivers and buried and so forth, and very little attention has been made, even by a lot of historians and by people who are doing documentaries on this. Very little attention on who those people were. How many people disappeared in the Mississippi prisons every year? And I want to tell you, because Frank, you actually went down to Mississippi as a student.
That's right.
Okay, so talk to us about what that experience was.
Well, first of all, the house that we lived in was owned by a black family. And one night, somebody threw 10 sticks of dynamite onto the house. Only one exploded, but it took off the front of the house. And that family had to be moved out of Macomb, Mississippi, which had lost 30 buildings, either churches or homes, in the prior 6 months. That family had to be moved and lost in New Orleans. Wow. Because they were, they if they'd stayed in the community, they would have died. And so I was introduced through a church. I participated in a church in New York in desegregation efforts of Lincoln Center, because the craft unions wouldn't accept African Americans. We picketed the Rexall drug stores because they wouldn't hire black individuals to work in the drug stores. You never saw a black teller in New York in a bank. And so the church that I belonged to, which was a Presbyterian church, they were involved in civil rights. And through that church and through the National Commission National Council of Churches, I was invited to go to Mississippi. And so I went down there in 1965.
So now what kind of training did you get before you went?
there was local training offered by civil rights workers in New York, and we were basically trained on using civil disobedience, but it had to be nonviolent. And so if violence occurred, we were trained to assist the person being subdued, try to impose our bodies if a person was being beaten. In Mississippi, we had in Macomb some white football players. I really felt sorry for them because they naturally were, to some extent, the bodyguard, as it were. And they were the ones that the white citizens would go after most to beat up if we had a march. Because
they were helping the African Americans.
Exactly. So, our defense, both in Macomb and later in Hattiesburg, was we had a major march in Hattiesburg because violence had really occurred there in late January. But our defense was, in the march, we made sure that the media knew that we were going to march. Drew Pearson of the Washington Post was a major commentator, and he would get the word out. And so the idea was get all the cameras possible to view whatever was going on. The clerics, the ministers and rabbis that supported, even though they might not use normally in their office clerical garb, they were asked to put on clerical garb because
that people would know.
Well, not only that, but the worst thing that Mississippi faced was blood on a white collar, and so that sort of thing happened all the time.
And I want to talk about the in Mississippi. It's in the Bible Belt. There's a big evangelical group of people who live there, and yet they utilize the Bible to justify
the changes. They would use any means to keep the system as it was. It was a one-party, I would suggest, fascist system that occurred, and you didn't buck that system. We talked to local African Americans. Why don't you participate? And they said, "Oh, you're coming down here causing us all sorts of trouble." One particular family that I knocked on the door of in Hattiesburg, he shoved us in the house because he didn't want to have anybody see him.
Wow!
On the
see
porch.
You on the front porch,
right? And so he gave us a real hard time. There's two of us, both of us from the North. And when we got back to headquarters, we told the staff of COFO where we'd been, and he turned out to be the quote Negro principal of the Negro High School. So he had a position that he had gotten into, and he certainly didn't want to change that.
And have that issue. Absolutely. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and if you have questions for our historians and professors here, give us a call, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Cassandra.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up with the question that you asked about evangelicalism and so forth. You have to remember that ever since the 19-teens, the Ku Klux Klan, when they nationalized, they adopted their platform under the aegis of religion, of Christianity, of being good Christians, of supporting the Christian family, and they wrapped the racism around that particular cloak. And so white supremacy, protecting white womanhood, being moral, being upstanding, was all about supporting white society. And so that then became part of how they defined God. God was white, the angels were white, Jesus was white, and everything that is good and wonderful is white. And so that continued to be part of how many whites throughout the country or even throughout the world began really define themselves. Some not to that extreme, of course, but that was a threat that was a very strong threat. It didn't just start with the Klan. It's something that had been part of European society for a long time, but certainly that then canonized itself into white supremacy.
I guess that just goes to show, Eric, how people can take anything, basically, but a philosophy and turn it to their advantage for what they're trying to do. I mean, whatever happened to, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. It's just really interesting to me that they could take Christianity and justify the treatment that was happening between the races.
Sure. That's a very interesting point that you bring up, because you have to understand there was a system in place that worked very, very well for white Americans at that time. Now, there were those that were white that did not agree with it. But when you're in a community, sometimes the person that's stepping out, you're going to be subjected to a lot of hardship, or as Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. You're going to have to endure some things. But it's something that when you look at where they were in Mississippi and we are as a country at that time period, you have to ask yourself, how did we get there? And it's something that I tell my students all the time. The reason for laws and public policy, why are they created? They're created to control and dictate three things: people, resources, and beliefs. And beliefs are extremely powerful because beliefs, they're just not spoken, but they're indoctrinated, and they are lived out every single day in all of your actions. So then when you wrap around your belief in God and the supporting document, the Bible, with that, now you're indoctrinating a system that's really hard to tear down, very hard to tear down. So that's a very interesting point that you bring up.
If you're just joining us, it's an Another View history lesson on Freedom Summer with my guest, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander of Norfolk State University, Dr. Eric Claville of Hampton University, and Associate Professor Frank Edgcombe, also of Hampton University. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Stephen joins us from Hampton. Hi, Stephen. You're on the air.
Hi. Yes, I'm calling from Hampton, Virginia. I happened to call my brother the other day and asked him if he was voting in the primaries that they were holding down there in Bolivar County or in Mississippi. And he says, no, he can't vote in the county. That he's gone down to register 3 or 4 times and has never gotten his voter registration card in the mail. And this is after he went to junior college there in that county, taught both high schools in that county, and is now an administrator in the high school system in that county, and has never received his voter card and has not been allowed to vote without that card. I just wonder if, it's just a case of the shoe being on the other foot nowadays.
May I ask, are you African American?
No.
Oh, okay. And so he is not able to vote, and he is not African American. So the question of whether or not Mississippi continues its habit of restricting people in voting. Cassandra.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the call, Stephen.
That situation is not the first one I've heard about Mississippi. People do not understand that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when it was just dismantled by the Supreme Court, under this what I call shameful argument that somehow we are in a post-racial society, is outrageous, and the nonsensical rationalization that was used by Scalia and a few others is really, in 20 years, this nation is going to look at that court and say nothing but horrific things about the court, and they accuse the Warren Court of being an activist court. But this court, by far, has been far more activist and has taken logic to extreme levels, even saying in the case when Bush was first, quote, elected, that this case cannot be applied to any future precedents, that this is not setting a precedent, in other words. And the court has never said anything like that before. And so when they dismantled the Voting Rights Act, they essentially removed the power of the federal government to oversee and regulate the voter registration activities of these states that have a very long history of excluding the right to vote. And in addition to that, you have a lot of people, it becomes politicized. So it's not just about black and whites, it's about political parties. And if you are seen as being a voter of a political group that's not in power, then you will probably be disenfranchised.
Wow, Eric.
Right. And Cassandra brings up a very good point with the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which she's referring to as the Protection Clause. You know, basically those states that historically discriminated against or disenfranchised individual African-American voters, had to send their change of districts, voting changing districts first to be pre-approved, the pre-clearance. But you bring up post-racial society, and there's something that the mainstream media has tried to push. But I believe that in doing that, and the election of our president, Barack Obama, what that really showed was the hearts of America. And I say hearts being plural because everyone has a different perspective, a different heartbeat toward various issues. And I believe that the dismantling of that section of the Voting Rights Act showed still the disposition that some individuals have toward African Americans. And let's go back to beliefs. The worst case ever decided by the U.S. Supreme Court was the Dred Scott decision. Justice Taney, he read the decision March 6, 1857, and it stated that the Negro has no rights which the white man is bound to respect. Now, you see that, and of course, that's the case that is deemed to have started the Civil War, and we were teetering on that, but that's what really,
pushed it over.
The catalyst.
That's it. So you see, there are still individuals and institutions that still hold on to those words that were spoken from our highest court. Okay, still held on. So now you have this time of Jim Crow and segregation, which is what we're talking about during Freedom Summer. And of course you're still going to see remnants of that. So yes.
Frank, let me ask you, because you talked about the experience of talking with a black family while you were in Mississippi, but when you talk to white people, what did they say? How did they justify what was going on?
You didn't really get to meet white people because
really,
they were just out of the picture as far as we were concerned as students. We basically, the communities were very highly segregated. You knew when the black community started because the asphalt on the road stopped.
And they were across a railroad track.
That's right, and so we basically did our work in the black community, especially in Macomb. They had a federal housing project, and so we did a lot of work in that project. This was a project, the housing was built by the federal government, and so was quite substantial. You got into the homes and you realized that the persons who lived there had no furniture. They lived on the floor. They had boxes or cardboard boxes to keep their belongings in, and most of the children seemed to be malnourished, and many of them had some sort of respiratory problem. And so when you went into the homes, you first of all had to convince these individuals that it was okay for them to let you in. And the idea,
you had to build a trust factor.
That's right. Then the idea was you had to go through all of the reasons why the white community would keep those individuals from registering to vote. For example, there was literacy tests, there were tests on American history, there were poll tax problems. That was all associated with any African American who wanted to go and register to vote. Plus the fact that if you went down by yourself, you're likely to be beaten on the steps of the municipal building. So you went in groups. Also, any African American who attempted to register to vote was named in the local paper. So that meant that they might lose their job, they might lose their mortgage, their car, their rental capability. And so those were all plans.
And these are things that hit, really to the heart of living.
Oh, yeah. As I said, it would take your livelihood away if you just go down there to register to vote.
I wonder, since you came from England when you were in your 20s, and to go into this type of part of America where segregation was so deep and so forth, from a personal perspective, what did you think?
An immigrant in the 50s coming from overseas saw America as not the home of the brave, but the place of total opportunity, freedom, what have you. Mm-hmm. You get to New York, and you even see in New York that the communities are segregated, that there is prejudice. And then you read in the newspapers about these murders and people not being able to vote, and or at least I saw them as not being true. So I had to some extent, go down to see for myself. And of course, what was being portrayed in the national news was exactly right. I mean, the segregation was just terrible.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Jennifer joins us from Newport News. Hi, Jennifer. You're on the air.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm just finishing this book called The Warmth of Other Suns, and it talks about the migratory pattern of blacks out of the South from the end of the Second World War on through to the 70s. And the migration pattern of typical, people moving usually goes to, they get the jobs as close to home as possible. So they move a few 100,000 miles or so, but close. But the actual migratory pattern mimics and follows the pattern of refugees. And I just thought that was such a pivotal moment in that book. It really struck me that, they're so traumatized that they didn't just go, we're going to get jobs in the next state over. We're going to actually, populate places like New York and California and get us far away from the places that injured us, emotionally and physically for so long. So I just thought that was a really powerful statement that the book made.
Okay, Jennifer, thanks for the call. Let's let our panel respond. Eric?
Yeah, ironically, the author presented that book at Hampton University because her father was a graduate of the university, and I had that book at home on my mantle. But she mentioned the refugee pattern, how it mimics in her opinion. You have to understand that American slavery was the worst type of slavery, worst type of institution of all slavery in the world. Mainly not just because of the brutality of it, but because of the tearing away of the identity of those people, of African Americans, from language, culture, food, even families. Okay, so when you experience that, and what I call the creating of another subhuman. Okay, so now once you create this particular institution and you have this person that you are constantly creating, okay, it takes an emotional and a psychological hold upon you. And a lot of that is hard, very hard to digest, very hard to live through. And of course, when something is that hard, you want to get as far away from it as possible. But it's mentioned a lot with educators when we do these conferences, 1619, Civil War conference and so forth. Why isn't this taught in our schools and so forth? And of course, there are many theories out there. I know Cassandra has hers. But I believe that the civil rights movement, or what I call the moral movement, what it should have been called, and American slavery, it is an indictment upon this country because it was morally wrong. It was civilly wrong. It was wrong across the board. But it was a business decision that the founding fathers and others in this country that were controlling at that time made in order to get the country where they felt it should go economically. So you have free labor free labor, building the country up, but at the same time tearing away people and tearing up a continent and countries over in Africa as well.
And
Cassandra, go
I'd
ahead.
like to follow up, Eric, because you said that very, very well. It was a business decision. And it was a business decision that really, in many ways, came from Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when they realized that whites and blacks who are equally disenfranchised, equally oppressed, will find a union, and that union could overthrow the government. And how do we as a society maintain privilege while at the same time exploiting the labor of both of these groups? How do we make sure that those groups never see that they have more in common than not in common? And so when you insert this factor of racism and a caste system based on race, then you create for the rest of the nation's history this pattern. And this pattern of behavior is 400 years old. And people seem to ignore that, or almost 400 years old. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard for this society to move in 30 or 40 or even 50 years away from a pattern that's almost 400 years old. And we're at that point. But the other thing I wanted to mention is something that you asked early on, mm-hmm. and that is, why Mississippi? And, we hear about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that helped to also recruit a number of the students. And this is when Kwame Ture, who was Stokely Carmichael, really got his fervor from his experiences in Mississippi, both in 63 and 64. But you had the NAACP, you had the SCLC also involved. But they chose Mississippi because of the activities that were going on in Mississippi and how Mississippi represented everything that was reprehensible about American race relations at that time. The governor of Mississippi, when the Freedom Summer was announced, said that if these civil rights workers come to Mississippi, blood would flow in the streets. Now you had a governor make a public statement really suggesting that he was going to murder people if they came to Mississippi, and nothing happened to that governor. No charges were brought against him for violating the Constitution, something that he swore he would uphold. And that is to protect the citizens, not the white citizens, not white supremacy, but all the citizens. And so the national civil rights workers and strategists chose Mississippi for that reason, but they would not have chosen Mississippi had there not been a grassroots and very stalwart grassroots movement already in place to really challenge this extreme system of racism.
Actually, because there was tension, and we only got about 5 minutes left, but there was tension then between the those grassroots folks and the students when Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney were murdered, because they said, well, all of a sudden we're getting all this attention because two of those people were white.
And there was not only conflict between the local students and the organizations, but there was conflict between the organizations. SNCC and CORE looked at how to do it differently from SCLC and NAACP. It was only with the operation of COFO, the Congress of Federated Organizations, that they were really able to bring all of this together into one area. And we all, irrespective of the particular group that we came from, we all live together in a community.
And we're able to work together. Eric.
Right, and you bring up a very good point. And in our country, especially at that time, and even a little bit now, unfortunately, if something doesn't affect the power structure, which are mostly white individuals, then you're really not going to get a lot of pushback from it. But at that particular time, you saw at the eulogy of James Chaney made by Dave Dennis, who was the leader of the Mississippi Corps, Congress of Racial Equity. Equality. He was just fed up. He was just tired of this. He didn't want to go to another funeral. And it was at Chaney's funeral in which this was made. Ironically, Dave Dennis, he's coordinating Freedom Summer now in Jackson, Mississippi at Tougaloo, and we're from the same city, Shreveport, Louisiana. But unfortunately, that's what tends to happen when you have that type of situation.
Now, the other thing that they did, and we got about 2 minutes left, but they also created Freedom Schools.
Right.
And the point of the Freedom Schools, Frank?
Was basically to help people prepare, African Americans to prepare to take the tests that were thrown at them by the white community. If a white individual wanted to register to vote, all they had to do, as long as they could make a cross and someone signed for them, they were registered to vote. Whereas a person from the black community had to pass a literacy test, had to pass a history, constitutional law test, had to make sure that they paid all their poll taxes. All of these things were brought up to disenfranchise the African American.
And by the way, this was not just Mississippi. Norfolk, before that whole poll tax was broken, Norfolk had a blank registration form that people had to fill out, and they had schools or programs in the libraries, like Blyden Library, that would help people memorize all the questions. So you would be shown a sheet of 20 questions, and then they would remove the sheet and hand you a blank piece of paper and tell you had to fill out the form.
Good gracious.
And that meant that you had to remember
everything that you
saw.
So we have another story that we were supposed to tell in today's show, but this conversation is going so well, I think we're going to continue to do this. Plus, we have some folks on the line who have not had the chance to talk to us. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. David joins us from Gloucester. Hi, David. You're on the air.
Yes, Barbara. I just wanted to let you know I'm a white person, and my father's family was from Brookhaven, Mississippi, which is about 30 miles north of where the gentleman was talking about Macomb.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, Brookhaven was a type of town that it was whites on one side and blacks on another. But I will say this much: from watching and living up there, the Ku Klux Klan, trust me, they knew everything that was going on up there, had a tight control at that time. And if you got out of line, regardless of white or black, I mean, it was nothing uncommon for people's houses to be burnt to the ground. I mean, I found it terribly disgusting, but that's the way life was. And I just wanted to, it really woke me up to how much people were being taken advantage of. And I'll take the comments off the air.
Okay, David, thanks so much for that call. Frank, you chuckled, but it wasn't a funny chuckle. It was this is pitiful chuckle.
We protected our workers, our civil rights workers, by CB radio. Every car, every house had a CB radio, and the community that we were in had a huge antenna. The police department also used CB radios to communicate. And so every midday, they would come on and say racial slurs over there on our channel. And we would immediately come out with pots and pans and make a huge din on their CB channel. And this would go on every day for about 15 minutes.
Agitation.
It was just one of the crazy things that,
Wow.
It was done to be intolerant.
This is the thing I love about being able to do this show, because we get real living history right here in terms of understanding exactly what it was like when you were there. Were you afraid?
Oh, yeah. Scared. In fact, when I came back to New Jersey to college, I was married. My wife told me that every time a police car would go by, I would start to shake, and because we were so fearful of the police down there. Another thing, the whole system was just totally built in. I went with a friend to give blood to a local resident in Hasburg, happened to be an African American. Because we were giving blood to an African American, we had to go in the back door of the hospital to give the blood. And the coordinator of the blood bank, she wouldn't even deal with us. She couldn't take it. And so this blonde nurse is taking our blood. We were accompanied by a rabbi who was about 300 pounds to give us support, and he couldn't give blood because he'd taken medication. But during the conversation as the blood is being taken, he asked the nurse, "Is your blood bank segregated?" And she got shook up and said, "Of course." And then she said, "Not only is it segregated, but the research that we're doing in the Methodist Hospital here will be published, and we expect that all blood banks in the North will be segregated." And he said, "Why is that?" And she said, "Well, it just happens that the colored people have a tendency to have sickle cell anemia."
Not all of them.
Not only that, but whites also have sickle cell anemia. And the point was, he was a hospital chaplain for 30 years. He knew more medicine than probably some of the doctors. He told us on the way back that she was statistically correct, but any blood that's given is tested. If a person has some problem, then that blood is discarded. But what threw me was that she had been trained to give that answer somewhere in her nurse's training. So that was an answer that the white community had embellished with her to make sure that she knew the right answer to give it.
And you know what's really interesting also, then does that mean that they would give tainted blood to black people? I mean, in other words, the institution of that thought is the problem.
That's right. Sure. I mean, the easy answer is, of course, that's probably what something that took place. But you think about the Tuskegee experiment, and that's just the one that we know about. But one thing that I like to tell individuals, I know we're closing down, if I can get to these closing points, is that remember the history and do your research on it. There is so much about American slavery in that time period. A lot of it horrific, a lot of it demonic, a lot of it deplorable, but a lot of it good because you see the strength of the people and the communities at that time to overcome that type of institution. But if you do your research on it, you'll see how the institution itself just really disrespected and those individuals.
I got to cut you off because we got less than 30 seconds. I do want to take a minute to say thank you to you all because this has been a great conversation. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, Professor of History and the Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the Study of the African Diaspora at Norfolk State University. Dr. Eric Claville, Assistant Dean for the School of Liberal Arts, Assistant Professor of Political Science and History, and Director of the Pre-Law Institute at Hampton University, and Associate Professor Frank Edgcombe, who is Interim Director of the William R. and Norma B. Harvey Library on the campus of Hampton University. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And audience, we will bring you the other story next week, but it was just such a great conversation. We wanted to keep going. So that's our show for today. If you'd like to hear it again or share it with a friend, please visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our eView newsletter, which is a once-a-week reminder of upcoming programs. Have a quick update that I'm looking for now in terms of the stabbing situation at the Norfolk Naval Base, and I believe they have identified the gentleman. They identified the suspect as 26-year-old Wilbur Harwell, an active duty third-class petty officer. So they are still searching for him. We hope that everything works out there. Next week, the Another View Roundtable joins us for insightful conversation about current events affecting the African-American community. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer. And Ashley Liggins and Austin Bell answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thanks for listening, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.